Hello everybody, and welcome to the GHP Brown Bag. I'm delighted to introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Benyam Mezmur, who is currently visiting at Harvard Law School and is the Eleanor Roosevelt Fellow in the Human Rights Program at the law school. Normally, Professor Mezmur is based in Cape Town, South Africa, where he is a professor at the University of the Western Cape in the law school there. And he's also Deputy Dean of their law faculty. Professor Mezmur is a very well-known and widely respected human rights lawyer and advocate, and has served in many positions within the United Nations, including being for a while the chair of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is the monitoring body for the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And he's also served on the Africa Committee on experts on the rights of children. So he is somebody who knows about a whole gamut of human rights issues, particularly related to children, and has traveled to, I think, most parts of the world to do missions and investigations. But today he's going to speak just about one aspect, one very, very acute human rights issue related to children, which is the whole issue of children of so-called foreign terrorist fighters or foreign armed fighters who are facing extreme human rights violations and difficulties as a result of a range of issues related to their detention, in some cases related to their denaturalization and other measures that states are taking. Anyway, it's really great to have you here. Benyam, thank you. I think most of the people listening to you in this room will have a public health background, but I know that there are people online who might have a range of backgrounds. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back here at the School of Public Health. I was here a couple of weeks ago during the Africa Health Conference, and I'm actually very happy to be back here again. It's a broad topic that I've been asked and I've kindly volunteered to deal with today, and I am aware that I have around 30 minutes. So I need to organize and execute around the priorities. And in doing so, I have a quick request, a couple of confessions, substantive part of my presentation, and ultimately I'll finish with a bit. Now, the request that I have, first things first, Syria and Turkey are two countries that I will mention quite a bit today. Probably know from the news that they're having tough times, heightened hardships, particularly the earthquake that hit those two countries on February 6 has actually costed the lives of around 50,000. To give you a bit of a perspective, that's almost half of the population of Cambridge. So my request here is to think of them, to show your solidarity in any way possible. And I'm very much alive to the hardship that they're going through, as I mentioned it quite a few times now. The confessions that I want to make is, first, when Professor Baba and I talked about the possibility of this topic being a topic for a brown bag seminar, I had thought that I would be able to share more good news, good practices, a large number of children being repatriated, and hopefully talking about their reintegration, some of the challenges that they're facing in terms of mental health, some of the challenges that they're facing as far as their parental environment, parental context are concerned, and so forth, so forth. But unfortunately, the situation is still very dire. There are a large number of children that are still stranded in those camps. So I probably will not have a lot of good news, but I'll try my best. The second point in terms of confessions is that it's a very emotionally charged issue. And I'm alive to that reality. If you're having a conversation about persons that are accused of or suspected of committing terrorist acts with someone who has directly been affected as a result of terrorist acts, they are very sensitive. Even if the person is not directly affected. I mean, speak to the Yazidis who were tormented under ISIS. Speak to the people who lost loved ones in Paris. speak to those that actually left thousands of people, government leaders, families and so forth in Iraq and Syria. So I'm alive to that fact. Here I'm not going to argue the case for ISIS by no stretch. It wouldn't even fit an inch within what my mandate and what I consider my role to be, not just only here in my day-to-day life as well, but I'm also expecting that, I don't expect you to agree with everything that I say. I actually expect you to question. I actually expect you to question the solutions and say, does this actually really make sense? And I understand if it has an emotional element in it. The third confession that I want to make is that I'm going to be a little bit self-critical, because my thinking on the topics also evolves. Some of the work that I have done within the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child with my colleagues, I look back at it 6 months or 8 months or whatever the time frame is, and I say to myself, why did we do this? Because we could have done it in this way and so forth. So I sometimes ask for forgiveness than for permission. So I'm sure if my colleagues end up watching this and they say to me, but you were one of the rapporteurs, and why didn't you raise this? Because it didn't cross my mind. My thinking was not necessarily aligned that way. Now, the substantive presentations. Let me do a precursor, righting the wrongs. There is a lot of wrong in this title, but I thought it would not be possible to fit it to be accurately reflecting the situation. First of all, righting the wrongs. The intention here is to give an indication that there are quite a number of wrongs that have been done. There's a question mark at the end, which actually says that this is an ongoing issue. We have not yet necessarily seen quite a good, even 50% of the picture, as it were, because it's a moving target. The second point is that it's about rights. It's not about privileges. It's not about having a special treatment and so forth. It's about a right, which basically means you are demanding what you're entitled to. Whosoever is upholding those rights is not doing you a favor. They're doing it because they have an obligation to uphold those rights. So that's an important area. The second part, children of ISIS fighters in camps in Syria. There are a number of elements here as well. It's loaded in the sense that, for instance, not all the children that are actually in the camps are children of ISIS fighters. But one of the things that I try to do is try to emphasize the emphasis on the children. Because, for instance, when we talk about persons with disabilities as compared to disabled persons with disabilities is more accepted, because you're trying to emphasize the person instead of the disability, right? So children of ISIS, I'm trying to emphasize the point about the children. Now, not all the children are actually children of ISIS fighters. Some of the parents have been accused, some of them are suspected, different levels of legal strata. And again, in relation to camps in Syria, yes, they are in camps in Syria. Some people would argue and say that these actually are not camps. These are actually proper prisons almost, because they are closed camps. The individuals are actually deprived of their liberty because they cannot freely move around. So there are a number of elements that are included there. Now, let me say a few things. Discussion about ISIS has almost faded into the background, because there was a declaration in March 2019 that they've been defeated, they've lost territory. Slowly but surely, the conversation about ISIS threat almost faded into the background. But interestingly, in the last couple of weeks, it's been mentioned a couple of times here in the US. For instance, the two Supreme Court cases, Gonzalez versus Google, and then another case, Twitter versus Tamne, it revolved around killing of a college student, one of them in Turkey, the other one in relation to the attack in Paris. So it's come to light in that context. Unless you have more than a passing interest on the topic of ISIS, you might not have picked from the news that last month 4 US service members and a working dog were wounded by an explosion during a helicopter raid in northeast Syria. You might not necessarily pick up from the news that the Central Command has conducted a total of 43 degradation of ISIS operations in Iraq and Syria. So yes, ISIS has been defeated. It doesn't necessarily occupy any territory, but we continue to reel from its remaining troubling legacies. And of course, one of these troubling legacies are these children that are stranded in these camps. Now, the situation in the camps. As I said, following the effective defeat of ISIL in March 2019, a large number of people were actually moved into these camps. Some of these children were being held in Baghouz, which is the last stronghold of ISIS. Some of these children were being used as human shields. Some of these children have been recruited and used in the context of the armed conflict to provide some support, and so forth, so forth. Now, the camps, the two main camps, Al-Hol and Roj, they are found in Northeast. The one that I will emphasize is Al-Hol for a number of reasons. Let me quickly show you. Okay, so this is Syria. You can see where Al-Hol is on the right-hand side of the top, and then where Roj is. They border Iraq. And Al-Hol is going to be the bit of the emphasis that I will be placing for a number of reasons. First of all, it actually holds a large number of people, 50 to 60,000 people in there. Approximately 20,000 of them are actually women, but we don't necessarily have proper figures because there is a lot of in and out of movement, but also because it's a detention camp, information does not come out very easily. Now, the camp actually has a section which is called the annex. That's where the children of foreign fighters, the women and so forth are actually held. Now, the situation in the camps is very, very dire. And I'm going to give you a bit of a picture. Human Rights Watch actually put it in its report that just launched a couple of days ago, that conditions in the camps are actually very dire. Turkish airstrikes in November 2022 hit a security post at one camp, killing 8 guards, and came perilously close to striking one of the prisons. Healthcare, clean water, shelter, and education and recreation for children are grossly inadequate. Mothers interviewed by Human Rights Watch said they hide their children in their tents to protect them from sexual predators, abusive camp guards, and ISIS recruiters. Children have drowned in sewage pits, died in tent fires, and been hit and killed by water trucks, and hundreds have died from treatable illnesses. There have been cases of girls who were found beheaded in the camp. Children who actually lost their fingers as a result of frostbites. This is corroborated by WHO, as well as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Young boys, for instance, have been in the camps being transferred to military detention centers alongside adult detainees. 226 days in 2020, and I'm not saying this is what WHO says. 27% of days are among children under 5 years old. So it's a space that is antithesis to children's rights. 14% of days are attributed to newborns, and apart from crime-related cases, other causes include COVID-19, injury, stillbirth, dehydration, shock, cardiac arrest, and others. I hope you get the picture. But speaking of pictures, let me quickly show you a video from New York Times. If you can, thank you. Okay. So this is an aerial view of the camp. Now, it's just to give you a bit of a sense. Quite a bit of the tents when this video was taken were relatively new. Now some of them are busy falling apart. There have been a number of reports that actually show that the annual mortality report of the WHO has made a number of recommendations to actually improve the health situation, but also a whole range of other aspects of the situation, including to enhance primary health care and oversight health services available, ensuring timely internal and external referral pathways, enhancing antenatal care and minimal initial service package, preventing avoidable car accidents, and enhanced preparedness and response for fire incidents, especially during winter. There is almost no education as far as the children are concerned. And in fact, there have been a number of YouTube videos where journalists actually go in and the children threaten with slingshots and throw at the reporters, or they even make some statements saying that you are infidels, we will crush your head, and so forth. So make no mistake about the fact that the place is absolutely horrible. It's an incubator for recruiting terrorists. It's a situation where neither the mothers nor the children are actually thriving. Now, let me move to the repatriation efforts that the countries have been making. Now, if one wants to talk about a repatriation policy that a number of the countries have been making, there is almost no policy coherence. As they say, there is no method to the madness. And I'm just going to give you a bit of a rundown. Here you can see that most detainees held in the camps for alleged ISIS ties are children. The nationalities you can see, the gender, men, women, and children, you can also see. Approximately 50,000, 55,000 detainees in the camps. And in the annexed part of the camp, 57 nationalities are actually represented. 57 nationalities. Now, if you try to look at the policy measures that have actually been taken, quite a lot of it has actually been informed because of backlash. There have been instances where governments actually said that they're going to repatriate children, but as a result of backlash, they actually decided not to do so. That seems to be the case, for instance, in the context of France. We have seen instances where in the time of elections, individuals or groups of individuals asking politicians what their positions as far as the repatriation of these women and children is concerned, and they gave responses that are not necessarily compliant with human rights standards, but they give responses that would help them to mobilize votes, that would help them to respond to the kind of questions that are being made and concerns that are being raised in their constituencies. If anybody wants to look at an example of a backlash, you need not look any further than in the UK, where a shooting range has used images of one bride who actually went and joined ISIS at the age of 15 as a target practice, saying that it had responded to requests from customers with record numbers wanting Miss Bagoum as a target. One article in The Economist said, the once belligerent radicals act now like aggrieved tourists stranded on a package holiday, end of quote. I get that. And I understand the kind of sentiments that are actually being raised by individuals. But these backlashes cannot really be a basis for making policy, whether or not you're going to respect your human rights obligations. There have been a number of additional arguments. European prisons are often an incubator of radicalization. Prosecution in Europe is complex. Very small number of years as a penalty for joining a terrorist organization is provided, unless otherwise you have evidence to show that these individuals have been involved in killing civilians and any other additional crimes such as torture, enslavement, and so forth. The question of admissibility is treated differently among different jurisdictions. For instance, some jurisdictions allow social media posting as evidence, and other jurisdictions do not allow that. Evidence passed by partner forces, such as the Syrian Democratic Forces, may not meet the requirements of being documented and looked after in a way that would ensure admissibility in domestic courts, and that has also been highlighted as a problem. Defendants could also seek to have charges dismissed on the grounds that they were returned from Syria to Europe or any other country in the world through an unlawful process. Now, if common sense is common to all, why and how should this be a problem of a child who had no involvement whatsoever, who didn't contribute anything materially or immaterially to the situation that he or she finds himself or herself in the situation? Countries like Belgium have actually said that we will just only repatriate children below the age of 12. What is the consideration there? Because these children have not really been accused of committing any crimes. And why would you actually leave? Why would you draw the line at 12 and not consider the 13, 14? Because under international law, a child is a person below the age of 18. Some of these children have been repatriated. Some children have actually been repatriated from these camps as a result of the strength and resolve of their grandparents, their cousins, their nephews, and a whole range of other extended family members. We have had cases where courts actually told governments that unless and otherwise you bring this individual and charge them properly, we're dismissing the case. We're actually kicking it out. In those circumstances, we have seen cases where governments actually put their acts together. They managed to get access to the camp, and they actually managed to repatriate the individuals that they wanted to prosecute within their jurisdiction. Now, these good examples that I just mentioned to you, if you can call them good examples, you can describe them in 2 words. That is good luck. Because it's on the basis of the luck that these individuals found themselves in, that the jurisdiction, the courts in those countries said, unless you bring them, we're kicking out the cases, that they were able to be repatriated. It's because they actually have grandparents. It's actually because they have extended family members that have resources to go to court and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, luck cannot be a child protection or good governance strategy. And luck cannot be the basis by which you try to uphold children's rights. As was already mentioned by Professor Baba, there has also been a policy of stripping citizenship. A number of countries have actually moved, multiple states have moved the power to strip their detained nationals of their citizenship, premised on safeguarding national security. Even though under international law there are exceptional circumstances by which you can't strip citizenship, a number of these instances do not necessarily meet the high threshold that requires seriously prejudicial and vital interests of the state that is actually stripping of citizenship. In some circumstances, this stripping of citizenships are happening for anticipating. They're not looking back. It's not because of what you did in the past. It's because of the potential that you would do in the future that you're actually being deprived of your nationality. Now, even though there are no children that we know of that have been deprived of their nationality through these processes, we already know the link between children and their parents and the citizenship bond that would have significant implications for these children. Furthermore, we have seen examples where security sector information has been used as a reasonable basis to professionally assess physical, emotional, social, and welfare costs for children of the consequences of citizenship stripping, which a number of human rights individuals and groups have taken issue with. Now, let me move to 2 cases, and let me try to concretize this conversation. As the Committee on the Rights of the Child, we had the opportunity to look at 2 cases. We're not a court, but we have some quasi-judicial role that comes close to a court, but not exactly a court. We don't make judgments, we make decisions. And the Committee on the Rights of the Child monitors the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 196 states. There is an additional instrument to it called the Optional Protocol on a Communications Procedure, where individuals, children, group of organizations can actually bring a claim before the committee to have a decision. Now, do we work as a 4th instance court where we're dealing with appeals? No, that's not what we do. But do we work as a committee, as a United Nations body that looks at complaints where children's rights have allegedly have been violated, and remedies have not been provided, or the remedies that were being provided were not adequate? Yes, we deal with those instances. And we had 2 cases dealing with children that are actually being detained in these camps. So let me freeze the frame that I was talking about and move to the 2 cases. The first case was against France. France has a large number of children that are detained in the camps. And even though they have been doing a bit of a progressive repatriation of these children, it has been far from adequate. And there has been a lot of politicization of the issue within the domestic sphere. For instance, at some stage, some of these grandparents who actually brought the communication said that we were told by the chief de cabinet of President Macron that they will be bringing all the children. And then subsequently, the same government, the same chief de cabinet said, we have decided that we're going to do this on a case-by-case basis. Now, within children's rights, I would like to believe even in public health, when you say you're going to do something on a case-by-case basis, it has a positive connotation, right? It has a positive connotation because you're going to do an individualized assessment. You're going to look at the age of the child. You're going to look at the kind of health risks and challenges and the history that he or she comes from and what he or she would be proceeding to and so forth. But in this case to case has been a tool to do away with transparency, it's been a tool to drag their feet, and it's been a tool to waste children's time. Now, this particular case that came to the committee, it involved 49 French children whose grandparents, nieces, and nephews are actually trying to bring these children that are being held in the old Al-Hol and the Al-Roj camps. One of the things that happened when the case came before the committee, the government of France actually repatriated some of these children, which we actually thought was a positive move. And we actually said that, okay, as far as these children who've actually been repatriated, we're not going to deal with it because we want to focus on the ones that have not been repatriated. Now, the complaints that they brought, they said that the rule on non-discrimination has been violated. The best interest of the child has been violated. The right to life, survival, and development has been violated. A number of children have actually died there, and they actually have significant sicknesses that they're facing. The right to the highest attainable standard of health has been violated. So they provided a number of, and deprivation of liberty as a measure of last resort has been violated because these children, for all intents and purposes, are in the camps and they're deprived of their liberty, and they have not been charged. They've not been accused. So they brought a number of provisions as being violated by the government. Now, they gave a few examples. For instance, they said that at some point in time in 2021, 62 children have actually died in the camps. That was at that stage almost 2 children per week that were actually dying in the camps. And the government of France knew about the situation in the camp. They also knew about their citizens being in the camp and the dangers and the dire situation that they actually find themselves in. They gave examples. For instance, a child named AF, who is 14 years old, suffered a serious injury to his left foot during bombing incident and needs urgent orthopedic surgery. They talked about a 17-year-old who's facing a threat of forced and early marriage. They talked about another child, DA, who's asthmatic, while another has a broken arm and no access to appropriate surgical treatment. And malnutrition is definitely at the heart of their accusation in terms of the situation that the children find themselves in. The government of France said this case is not admissible. They said that the Committee on the Rights of the Child does not have the mandate to deal with this case, and they raised a number of objections why they actually believe the committee shouldn't deal with this. First of all, they said that we are not responsible for the situation in the camp. We didn't create this situation on the children, on their mothers. They left on their own will. They also said that the application of the Convention on the Rights of the Child is predominantly, almost like 90% applicable to children that are actually in France. In very exceptional circumstances, we would be held accountable to what they call extraterritorial obligation. For instance, if it is a child of a diplomat, it could be in the instances where your armed forces have actually violated a child's right in another jurisdiction. But other than that, they say that in this particular case, we have no responsibility almost whatsoever. The Committee on the Rights of the Child said, no, absolutely, we disagree. Even though you're not running the camps, even though you didn't create this bad situation that the individuals and the children find themselves in, we cannot leave the children in a legal limbo where nobody has responsibility for them. And the committee said, because of them being French citizens, you have some responsibilities that you actually have to uphold. In this particular case, you have the capability and the power to affect the rights of these children, including by repatriating them, including by engaging with the Syrian democratic forces to make sure that these children are identified, including that they be provided with some protection to be transferred to Turkey so that the French embassy there can actually provide them the kind of consular services that it actually needs to provide them, and so forth, so forth. Once the objection on whether the committee has jurisdiction or not was resolved, at least the committee said, no, we don't agree with you, and we pushed back. They actually had to engage with the committee on the merits of the case. What are actually some of the critical issues that need to be addressed in the case? For instance, the government of France said that the camps are actually not safe, so we cannot risk the lives of other French individuals to actually go and engage. And our view was, if you really appreciate the fact that the camp is not safe, why do you believe it's actually safe for the women and the children, particularly the children, that's what we're interested in as the Committee on the Rights of the Child, to actually be stranded there for such a long period of time? They also say that what the children are actually facing does not qualify as detention. This might be too legal, and I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. But the Committee on the Rights of the Child said, no, this actually qualifies as detention because the children are in a camp and they're not able to move around as they wish. The government said, while repatriation may, in certain circumstances, be one of the ways in which consular assistance is provided, it is by no means an obligation for the sending state. The Committee on the Rights of the Child said, no, it's not just only one that may be provided, but the committee said it's one that you should provide. And there was already quite a number of examples that the government of France was sending intelligence officers, the government of France had diplomats on the ground, the government of France had actually engaged with the Syrian Democratic Forces. That actually showed that there was already a channel of communication that was taking place. There was also already evidence that the government of France had repatriated some children back into France, even though we're not terribly sure what criteria was used to repatriate certain children and leave the remaining ones behind. So the committee said ultimately that there is a violation of Article 6 on the right to life surviving development. We say that there is also a violation of children's right from being protected from cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, because the condition that the children found themselves in the camps was indeed cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And the committee also reasoned and said that the government of France knew about the children's situation for a long period of time. So in this particular case, the children were not making an urgency on their side, an emergency on the side of the government of France. So that was the first case. The second case involved Finland. Sorry about that. Now I'm going to draw a couple of nuances and differences here. The difference between the two cases is that the number that is involved in the case of France is in the case of Finland is limited. But there is a critical, there were only 6 children that were involved. There is a critical element here. 3 of the children were repatriated while the case was evolving, so we didn't have to deal with the 3 children. We needed to deal with the remaining 3 children. But the children in the case of Finland were all born in the camps. What does that actually mean? Does anybody want to try? Why is this relevant? In the previous case in relation to France, the majority of the children were born elsewhere. Some of them were born in Syria. But in this particular case, all the children were born in Syria. It has implications as far as the age of the children is concerned. Because at the start of the case involving Finland, the age of the children was 3 years or younger. In children's rights language, I'm sure it's the same in School of Public Health, in the public health sector, we talk about the first 1,000 days. How critical and how important, how much of a break or make circumstances those are. So there was a child, MUK, suffers from serious malnutrition and frequent diarrhea. He has received no medical care and has, as a result, not developed at a normal rate. There was another child that was suffering from pneumonia and was hospitalized multiple times. At that stage, she was recovering, but suffers from frequent diarrhea and other diseases. There was another child, SM, who's 2 years old, almost died on several occasions, and so forth, so forth. Again, in this particular case, the government of Finland wanted to push back. They said the committee doesn't have jurisdiction. We didn't create this situation. It's going to be very risky. The Syrian Democratic Forces, their name is a bit tricky. They're not from the government of Syria. They're actually a group of people, Kurdish people, who are actually running, and they are not a state armed group. They are a non-state armed group. And they actually occupy territory, and they're actually running that space, not as a matter of law, but as a matter of fact, and they do exercise effective control in that space. And the committee said, no, absolutely, in this case, okay, we don't agree with you. You need to actually take responsibility. You need to repatriate the children instead. Now, 2 of my colleagues, my colleague from Belgium and my colleague from Uruguay, agreed with the committee, but they wanted to go a bit further in relation to the 3 children. And now when I look back, I almost agree with my 2 colleagues, and I'm just going to give 2 or 3 reasons why. First, in the first case, the children were 6, 7, 11, and so forth. In this particular case, their age is 3 or less. And the committee should have been more proactive and said to the government of Finland, not just what we said to the government of France. We should have actually added some sense of urgency in terms of what the government of Finland should have done, particularly because of their age. Secondly, there was more additional information about pneumonia and diarrhea, and in relation to the fact that one child almost died several times, and so forth, so forth. And that should have also served as a bit of a sense of urgency for the committee to actually demand a bit more. In both cases, one of the things that we did was we asked both the government of France and the government of Finland to engage, to take measures while the repatriation process is ongoing, to engage with the authorities, the Syrian Defense Forces, and to provide some sort of services that will actually help to alleviate the situation of the children. But we didn't pronounce that as an obligation on the part of the government. And I do believe that we should have done that in relation to the children in relation to Finland. The third part, which is very interesting, is that in 2019, the Finnish authorities organized a pediatrician to be on call and at the mother's disposal for online consultations concerning the children's health. In April 2020, another remote service, a Finnish school of distant learning, was introduced. These are interesting developments. Are states going to be relieved of their obligation to actually repatriate these children because they're providing an online pediatrician? Are they going to be relieved of their responsibility because they're providing an online school? The committee's view is absolutely not. And we should have actually explicitly called out this arrangement. While we believe that as an interim measure, as an interim arrangement, it actually has some value, it's not going to be a measure that the states can actually do to further prolong the repatriation of these children. Let me conclude. There are some good practices. Not everything that I said is actually, or not everything that is out there is bad. Several countries such as Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kosovo, Albania, and more recently Kyrgyzstan have actually provided quite very useful and good practices in terms of how to deal with these cases. They've actually repatriated individuals in groups. They've actually done an assessment of the situation of the children, but also the situation of their families back home. There have also been a few other examples from other places. For instance, there have been examples prior to the return of all child returnees. All the extended families are screened by child welfare services to assess their suitability. Factors that are taken into consideration include pedagogical, social environment, age of the child, and the extended family members, violent extremist ideologies among the extended family members, ability to deal with the media, and trust in the care and support of institutions. There are already some of these examples that are actually working that could have been replicated in these cases. De-radicalization is absolutely critical. De-radicalization, not just only for the purpose of reintegrating these children back into their communities, de-radicalization as a tool for prevention as well. And this is one of the areas where the international community is falling behind. The resources that are actually being expended in relation to the war on terrorism should be refocused to address this pressing but neglected manner as far as de-radicalization is concerned. Health and mental health need to be very central to this conversation that we're actually having about this children. There is already some good examples from Kyrgyzstan in Arivan. Children who've actually been repatriated, entirely clueless about school environments. One of the children actually screams every time the school bell rings. One who's been reintegrated into the school system actually has been huddling under the desk for almost a full week. One child who's actually been asked about whether or not they knew about schools said that when we were there were no schools. We spent a lot of our time washing blood off the floor, end of quote. So the mental health situation of these children needs to be taken into account very, very seriously and urgently, and repatriation is almost a choiceless choice. This conversation that we're having today is not just only relevant for children in northeast Syria. It's relevant for Boko Haram situations. It's relevant for the situation in Mozambique. It's relevant for the situation in the Philippines. It's relevant for the situation in relation to Al-Shabaab and children that are associated with that. But also the situation in Afghanistan and other contexts that we may have. Now, someone might say that I've been very hard on the Western countries. Maybe I was. But there is a long list of other countries that have not actually repatriated their children. And I'm just going to show you as a final slide. I think I'm having okay. So this is an estimated total repatriations per country. I don't want you to spend too much time on the numbers, just to give you a bit of a sense. Children, women, men, and the total. It's a list of 35 countries. As I mentioned earlier, there are 57 countries that actually have confirmed citizens within the camps. That's the first part. The second part is the men are almost, of course, falling between the cracks. They're not getting repatriated. But of course, women are also not getting repatriated. But you have to also keep in mind that the majority of them are actually children. In the camp in Al-Hol, out of around 11,000, almost like 7,000 or 8,000 are actually children. So you can see that the number, if I go to the next one, it's almost the same. But you can also, the third thing that you can see is that Russia, for instance, has repatriated a large number. You can also see that Kazakhstan has repatriated a significant number. So these examples from these countries need to be taken into account, but also the countries that are not on this list need to pay very close attention. Tunisia, for instance, they have a number of people there, they haven't repatriated. Sudan has a number, Nigeria has a number, and there are a whole range of other countries that have children in those camps, they have not repatriated them. One of the directions that this whole conversation points to is that while the Convention on the Rights of the Child is universally ratified, 196 countries, the only guilty exception is the United States. There is a tendency to undermine it in the context of emergencies. We've seen it in the 2015-2017 migration crisis. We've seen it in the context of COVID pandemic. China has been accused of committing crimes against humanity and possibly genocide against the Uyghur population and other Muslim ethnic groups in the northwestern region of Xinjiang, and a number of children are actually part of this. A group of children who many would say were abducted by Russia from the streets of bombed out Mariupol in Ukraine appeared on stage inside Moscow's stadium with a soldier who helped to liberate them in full display. These are some of the examples that we're actually seeing that continue to undermine the upholding of children's rights in the context of emergencies. And you can take it for granted that the situation in northeast Syria is not an isolated situation. There are a number of other examples that actually show this effort, some of it very, very concerted effort to undermine the application of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in the context of emergencies. Now let me come to my bit. There may be risks to repatriation, but repatriation actually pays a better dividend from a child rights, economic, social, and also security lens. And if I were to make a bet, I would make my bet on the last one. And I really like my chances. Thank you very much, and let me take any questions.
Thank you so much, Benyam. Do you mind fielding questions?
Yes.
Yeah. So the floor is open. Would anybody like to start? Question? And just you're looking at online.
Yeah, I'm looking at Zoom.
So those
so
online,
maybe
you also get the opportunity to write
yeah,
your questions.
yeah,
But if you
I
don't
think
have
so.
questions, I have questions.
Okay, go ahead, yeah. And maybe introduce yourself.
My name is Betsy Osborne. I'm staff and also a student here. My question is, from a legal perspective, how do you balance the benefits of repatriating a child to what is presumed or can be confirmed as a better and safer environment against what might be also perceived as the benefits as keeping the ability for a child to be with an adult that they're bonded with, whether that be, for instance, their mother or another adult that they bonded with. From a legal perspective, how do you balance that? And I wasn't clear in the examples you're providing how many of these children are in a camp where they are with their bonded adult and how many have been separated.
Yeah, it's a very important and very useful question. Because it also ties with one critical point that the government of France has been raising. But I will come to that in a moment. The first point is, if we are actually applying the best interest of the child as a standard, indeed which should be the standard, there are a number of elements that you actually need to take into account. For instance, family separation is as an exception. You need to uphold the family unit because it often promotes the best interest of the child. In the instances when the best interest of the child demands separation, then you can actually do that. That's the first point. The second point is, in many of these instances, governments actually argue and say that the mothers are actually refusing to allow the children to be repatriated. They do make that argument. Now, the counter-argument, there are a number of counter-arguments. One is, you need to strike that balance between whether keeping this child in that environment promotes their best interest, or whether it actually makes sense to repatriate that child separately. That's one. It depends on the child's age, it depends on the bond, it depends on a whole range of other considerations that we take into account. The second element that you also need to keep in mind that the government, in many of our assessments, at least, that we have seen, the governments are actually making this argument to drag their feet on repatriation. That's what they're doing. In domestic spheres, when the bond between a child and a parent is not promoting the child's best interest, those bonds are actually legally broken. You can actually do that through the court systems. In fact, some of these countries have been accused of having a very aggressive child removal processes at the domestic sphere. Here I have in mind countries like Norway, where a number of professionals have actually written letters saying that the child removal services that are actually being provided at the domestic sphere do not promote children's best interests. But in this particular case, they like those arguments because it helps them to kick the can down the road. The third element that I just want to mention is that the evidence shows that in the instances where the children have been repatriated with their mothers, it has significantly helped to facilitate the reintegration process once they also return. One of the errors that Kyrgyzstan made that they should have learned from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan is to actually repatriate the children with their mothers. Because the evidence was there. Initially, they didn't do it, and that created a lot of problems for the purpose of the reintegration. The fourth part, in terms of the numbers, even though data is very sketchy, there is evidence to show that almost 90% of the children that are actually in the Al-Hol annex where the foreigners are being held, they are with their mothers. There are no males in there. There are boys, but there are no adult males that are actually being kept there. So that bond between the mothers and the children is being maintained in the camp setting. But again, quite a number of, we have heard it from France, we've heard it from Finland and so forth, where the governments have actually said the reason why we haven't actually repatriated X, Y, Z is because of the fact that the mothers are actually refusing. There is a final element that I want to mention here. Some of the governments are asking for commitments from the mothers to agree to the separation of bonds between the mother and the child once repatriated and arrived at the country where they actually are a citizen. And this is forced removal because these individuals are actually being given two bad options that if they get repatriated, the moment they arrive in country X, they will agree to forego their parental rights and responsibilities as far as their child is concerned. And the special rapporteur on upholding human rights while countering terrorism has been calling out a number of governments for actually making these deals behind closed doors.
Thank you. We have two questions online, Benyam. So I think, Dan, you were first.
Thank you. I'm Dan
I hear
Wickler.
you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can. Thank you.
Yeah, Dan Wickler, I'm a professor in this department. Thank you very much for this wonderful account. I'd like to ask about something that's not quite on target, but it's closely related. I don't know if you listened to a podcast about a year ago by some journalists who actually entered the Kurdish-run areas and got a chance to talk with the Kurdish fighters. These are all women in this case, about their management of these ISIS enclaves. And then they were admitted into the ISIS enclave, and they interviewed some of the ISIS women. And it was a fascinating mix of factors here. From the point of view of the Kurds, the ISIS women and their children were protected by human rights considerations, by their international agencies that were concerned about their plight, as bad as it was, but still they had this kind of support. And also they benefited from an international network of benefactors who had their address and would send supplies to them, so that according to them, the women in those camps were actually living at a much more comfortable standard than the armed soldiers who were there, who were responsible for their welfare and who were in charge of the area. And they found this especially galling because this gets to this question of de-radicalization that you mentioned. They said that within the ISIS enclaves, de-radicalization hadn't begun at all. The women were as vociferously taken up with the ISIS ideology as they ever had been. And moreover, the moment their children passed the stage of being toddlers, they were thoroughly indoctrinated and became real threats to the Kurdish soldiers who were and other helpers who were supposed to be administering them. And so the Kurds who spoke to the podcaster said that everyone was afraid of drawing assignments to get anywhere near those enclaves because they were under constant physical attack, and in fact, many had been wounded and killed. And a lot of it comes from these kids, some of whom are early teens. So from their point of view, the international human rights community was part of the problem because the ISIS fighters were very aware of all of the resources they could draw on from people concerned about their welfare from a human rights point of view, and they used that to obtain privileges and to resist any kind of control measures, including control measures that would have enhanced the safety of the Kurds who were taking care of them. So this is a kind of a distorted mirror image of the reality that you're talking about. I don't think any of the things I've said here gainsay anything that you said, but it complicates it a bit. I wonder if you have any comments.
Dan, I'm gonna, if it's okay, Benyam, I'm gonna ask Benyam just to note down the question because we have 3 questions and 10 minutes, and in the interest of getting to all of them, is that all right? So if you just hang in there, thank you. So Mayan, you're next.
Thank you. I am Mehan Abdullah from Afghanistan. I'm a postdoc fellow at the Takimi program, and this is such a fascinating presentation, and thank you for the efforts and for the presentation. I have a few questions, but one very critical question was, how do you categorize the training of Afghan children and religious schools being radicalized in neighboring countries away from their parents? Have you or your organization work on this? That is one question. And the second question is, what is the position of humanitarian organizations working in health sector, such as MSF, to provide healthcare services? Because I have seen the videos and it is indeed dire. And the third question is
I think let's leave it at 2, Mayan,
okay.
if that's okay.
Okay.
Did you get the questions, Benyam? Yeah, okay, thank you. And we can always come back if there's time for more. Lexi.
Hi. So my question is, these governments seem to see these children as potential liabilities and perpetrators of violence. And one concept that we learned about actually in Professor Baba's class is this concept of unchilding. And why are these governments, why don't they see these children more as victims, recognizing that any recruitment or use of children under the age of 18 by non-state armed groups is a violation of international law?
Thank you.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, so those are 3 big questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting questions. Let me start with the last one. Whether or not these governments actually see these children as risks and liability and so forth. It's very interesting in the 2 cases that we had in relation to Finland and France. None of the governments actually said they see these children as security threats, because these children are actually 5-year-old, 6-year-old, and so forth. But you can see from the policy measures that some of them have done, for instance, Belgium, where they said they will only be repatriating children below the age of 12, they see that they draw a threshold where they say, as far as children above this threshold are concerned, they might actually see them as a security threat. So it's absolutely important to keep that in mind. Now, the age 12, it might be said, is because of the issue of minimum age of criminal responsibility. At what age can you actually hold children accountable to the legal processes for crimes that they might have committed? The Committee on the Rights of the Child actually says that age should not be 12, should actually be as much as possible 14 or above 14. But we haven't seen many countries that have actually made that argument as well, saying that we are drawing that age line because of. Now, if France and Finland had argued the case and said that they're not repatriating these children because of security risks, that would have been a ridiculous argument. And surely they didn't want to do that. And secondly, not many countries actually explicitly say that they're not going to repatriate. That's a very important point to actually keep in mind. Because like the report that came from Human Rights Watch the day before yesterday in relation to Trinidad and Tobago, they still say that they're actually engaging with the issue, they're making legal arrangements, they're actually engaging with the forces, but time is actually running out. And as we often say, one thing that children don't have is actually time. 1 year in the life of a child is 6% of his or her childhood. So that's an important one. The second point in relation to how to categorize the children in the context of Afghanistan, in the situation in Afghanistan, and MSF and other organizations providing healthcare and so forth. The situation as far as security is concerned is very dire. So there may be valid concerns on the part of service providers, MSF, I can't speak on behalf of MSF, but a number of other stakeholders to actually provide services there. That also could include some UN agencies and so forth. We have seen news media reports saying that because of risks and so forth, they're going to withdraw their services and so forth. So that's also a concern. That should be an additional motivation why governments should actually repatriate these children, not the other way around. Now, in relation to the children in Afghanistan, I just only touched on the fact that this situation, some of the experiences that are actually drawn from these situations, whether in de-radicalization, reintegration, and so forth, would have relevance for children in the context of Al-Shabaab or in Mozambique, Philippines, and Afghanistan. That's probably relatively a longer conversation, which I'm happy to take forward after this. Now, in relation to the first question, I'm not sure if I have actually seen that specific podcast, but I'm just going to mention a few things here, my off-the-cuff reactions on this. One is, as far as the prison for the adults, the male is concerned, some people have actually called it the United Nations of Terror, because it's going to serve, again, as a basis and a ground for further radicalization. Our leadership actually seems to suffer from collective amnesia. Where did ISIS actually come from? 12 of the top leadership of ISIS actually came from Kambuka. And Kambuka was a military prison that the government of the US was actually running. So the current situation in relation to the adults is related to that. The second point, some people have actually said this situation that the children find themselves in northeast Syria is the Guantanamo of Europe. I actually would be tempted to even extend it a bit further because it includes a whole range of other countries beyond Europe. Why do they say that? They say that because these children and women are being left behind. They're not charged. There are no even concrete allegations or charges that have been labeled against them, but we're actually trying to operate in an illegal environment and drag our feet as far as their accountability is concerned. Nobody is actually sticking their neck out and saying that this woman is innocent and that one is innocent, or this child is innocent. If governments actually have claims, they have to repatriate these individuals and make them stand for trial. That's what a civilized world actually would do. Now, the third point that I just want to reflect in relation to the first question is the following. There have been some reports that the situation where the foreigners' wives and their children find themselves in is actually better than the one where the Syrians and the Iraqi children find themselves in. To a certain extent, that may be true. It may be in relation to the tents. It may be in relation to the fact that some of these women have access to internet, cell phone, and so forth, so forth. That's also the reason why when I actually introduced the topic, I said that even though it's about Syria and the camp, it's actually much broader than that. When I talked about the funding on the war on terror, de-radicalization funding should actually be done for a whole range of other stakeholders. And I'm just going to single the United Nations here. If you look at one of the recent, it's been 5-6 years, recent resolutions from the Security Council, Resolution 7291, it called for preventing the radicalization to terrorism and recruitment of foreign terrorist fighters, including children. For instance, Syrian children, Iraqi children, they're not explicitly addressed in these resolutions. And the kind of attention to detail that is provided need to be able to go around for all children and not just only to specific children. And the final point that I just want to flag here is the following. The US government is providing some finances to the Syrian democratic forces to actually run the camps. They have actually helped them to upgrade the fences, to provide security measures, and so forth. In fact, the government of France, and to a certain extent a number of other governments, have actually raised this point that they are actually providing assistance to the Syrian defense forces as if they are saying, we actually are doing some good, so we should actually get credit for this. They can get credit for providing assistance to the Syrian defense forces. But that's not going to take away the fact that they need to repatriate the children that are their citizens that are actually currently housed in the camps.
Benyam, thank you so much. I think you've raised very profound questions, and I'm sure there are people who might want to follow up afterwards, but we're out of time. So thank you very much indeed for a really fascinating talk.